Cool. Thank you very much for the introduction there. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. So just to add a little bit more by way of introduction, I'm Danny, and I grew up in Liverpool, England. And before leaving for university, I was a very keen sportsman, playing football before focusing on track and field. I competed in the 1 and 200 meters. I then spent 10 years or so at Christ's College in Cambridge, where I began by studying natural sciences from a biological point of view as an undergrad, before moving on and falling in love with biological anthropology and human evolution as a master's student. And that then led to a PhD and a postdoc in human evolution. Now, alongside my studies, I was again heavily involved with sports. I was competing for my college in rugby, in football, in water polo, swimming, and for the university in track and field, as well as in rowing, and for the GB squad in canoeing. So I finally left Cambridge in 2019 to take a faculty position here as a lecturer in physiology at Loughborough University. And the last 3 years or so have been absolutely fantastic. It's allowed me to work with a range of incredible collaborators, colleagues, and some great students. Now, alongside my research, I'm a very keen ultra endurance athlete. I've cycled across continents and set fastest known times and official Guinness World Records for both ocean rowing and ultra endurance swimming. And this, along with my research, will be the main topic of my talk today. So throughout high school and university, I competed in sports that might be could possibly be classified as the more traditional sports. This began with football, moved on to track and field, canoeing, and eventually it became river rowing, as we can see in the picture here. This was great. I loved it. I loved training. I loved pushing myself to be as good as I could possibly be. And I loved the buzz of competition even more. But while I was studying, I rowed for Cambridge University heavyweight rowing team against Oxford University. And at the time, it was amazing. I trained on rowing machines next to world champions. I rowed in boats with Olympic medalists. We would spend our Christmas breaks high in the Pyrenees, training at beautiful mountain lakes. And during the summer, we would travel to competitions across Europe, and I loved it. But gradually, I began to feel restricted by my sports. The training and competition were all in these really highly controlled environments, whether it was at the gym, on the river, at a lake, or in a stadium. And I was finding this to be incredibly limiting and increasingly frustrating as time went by. I loved exploring my own physical limits, but I was increasingly drawn to exploring the world as well. So I began looking at maps and wondering if I could use my body to explore the world. Now, as I lived at Cambridge at the time where everybody had a bike, I thought that cycling might be a good way to explore. So I began looking at the areas surrounding Cambridge, first of all, then at the south of England. And before I knew it, my imagination here was running wild, and I was looking at whole countries and then continents. So I hatched a plan with my girlfriend at the time. After graduating, we would fly to Mexico City and cycle all the way to the southern tip of Argentina. Now, the mere idea of this was incredibly exciting. I'd never been to Latin America before, but I'd heard so much and read so much about it. And I think in retrospect, I was attracted to this expedition by a number of things. And firstly, it was the enormity of the journey. The ride itself would be about 10,000 kilometers or 6,000 miles, and it would take 6 months. We would cycle through 11 countries. So after landing in Mexico, we would cycle through Mexico, then across the border to Belize, then on to Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. And then a stretch of impregnable jungle that runs coast to coast across Panama meant that we'd then have to fly over to South America. And from there, we'd ride through Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and then finally back to Argentina and Tierra del Fuego and Ushuaia. The second thing that attracted me was the environment, the nature. The ride would begin by passing through the volcanoes of Central America, We would then descend into the heat of the desert, the humidity of the jungle, and then out onto the plains of the Yucatan Peninsula. And all of this would be before we even left Mexico, which was the very first country along the route. So to make this happen, as you can imagine, a lot of work was necessary. As well as having to submit my thesis 6 months before my 3-year deadline, there was a lot of Googling that needed to be done. Firstly, what type of bike would we need? What type of tent? What route would we take? What type of maps would we need? And during the last year of my PhD, when I wasn't working on my thesis and when I wasn't on the river rowing, I was poring over maps and doing as much paid work as I possibly could to save enough money for this trip. And this last year of studies passed in a complete whirlwind. And before I knew it, we were boarding a flight to Mexico. The journey was breathtaking in every conceivable way. The first 2 to 3 months were brutally difficult. We landed in Mexico in the middle of July, and once we descended from the mountains, the temperature rose, and at one point it didn't fall below 40 degrees Celsius for 3 weeks straight. That's day and night. We had a budget of only $10 a day, so we wild camped most nights instead of sleeping at hostels. We soon learned to be cycling by sunrise in order to get 2/3 of the day's mileage done before it got too hot. We'd then rest under a tree somewhere before cycling for a few more hours before sunset. Despite these difficulties, the landscapes were absolutely stunning. Cycling from north to south meant that we passed through a lot of different landscapes. In Central America, we cycle past and we climb volcanoes. We passed through desert and jungle. In Southern America, we climbed high into the Andes. We rode at over 4,000 meters of altitude across the spectacular Bolivian Altiplano. We then cycled the endless Argentinian pampas, and finally along the unpaved 1,200 kilometer southern highway in Patagonia, which is a dirt road that winds through the Andes and past turquoise rivers and hanging glaciers. And it was just like being on another planet. Now, I've only scratched the surface of this trip here, but the key point was that it really opened my eyes to the beauty of the world. And the thrill that I found came with exploring inaccessible and remote places by physical power. I saw people and met people and saw places that I'd never even imagined before. And this led me to seek opportunities to push my physical limits with cool people in great places in as many ways as I could. So this America's cycle led to a series of ultra endurance challenges, and all were driven by this deep-rooted desire to explore beautiful places using my own power. Now, these have included 2 ocean rows and 2 ultra endurance swims since. Now, the swims were both new records for ultra swimming, which is generally regarded as any distance over 10 kilometers or 6 miles. Now, these records were for setting the fastest time to swim the full length of all 13 lakes in the English Lake District, which added up to about 40 miles or 70 kilometers. These lakes, of course, included England's longest lake, Windermere, which alone took over 5 hours to swim. But today, I'll be talking about the 2 ocean rows that you can see here, the Polar Row in 2017 and the Black Sea Row last year in 2022. So firstly, the Polar Row. Now in 2017, I was lucky enough to join a team who were attempting to row across the Arctic Ocean. And the plan was to row from the Norwegian island of Svalbard, on the slide there, to Iceland. And this route was really exciting because no one had ever rowed across the Arctic Ocean before. Polar environments had always really fascinated me, and the sheer wildness of the area really seemed to draw me in. I'd always seen Svalbard as being this mystical land that I'd love to visit one day. Svalbard literally translates as cold shores. And in Svalbard, the sun doesn't set for 4 months straight in the summer. Now, our row would begin in a town called Longyearbyen, which is one of the 4 northernmost settlements in the world. And we'd then head southwest towards Iceland, which was another country that had fascinated me. The next thing that drew me to this expedition was the team, and it was a great team to be part of. The crew on the left there included double Olympic champion rower Alex Gregory, who had won his second Olympic gold medal in Rio only a year before. We also had in the center ocean rower Carlo Ficino, who had previously rowed from California to Hawaii. We had a captain who held the speed record for rowing across the Atlantic Ocean. And completing the team was Sam, a British national level rower, and Tyler, a young adventurer from the United States. So after a whole lot of training and about a week before the row, I took the 3-hour flight due north from Oslo to Svalbard and met the team at our base ahead of the expedition. We were lucky enough to have been gifted this small cluster of log cabins for our time on the island, which were just on the waterfront outside of Longyearbyen, and staying in these cabins for a week was worth it was worth the trip alone. Now, the boat itself was pretty small. This was our boat. It was 29 foot long, so just under 9 meters, and of course it had no motor or sails. There was a small cabin at either end that you can just about see, and there was a totally sealable hatch just about wide enough to climb it through. And in between the cabins, there were 3 rowing positions. And we had a 6-man crew, so the plan was to row in 2 shifts of 90 minutes each. Now, this is a photo of me having just squeezed myself into the cabin. And before the expedition started, we spent a week on Svalbard, working on the boat 15 hours per day, fitting safety lines, packing food ration packs, and sorting our kit bags. So while we were in Svalbard, we had a last-minute change of plan. Instead of heading straight for Iceland, as we can see here, we decided to first row north and see how close we could get to the North Pole before we were stopped by the permanent ice shelf. So our route went from this to this. And I was very excited about this new plan. I couldn't wait to see the icebergs that lay north of Svalbard. And finally, after all this preparation, both before, pre-Svalbard and on the island, we were ready to go. We departed at 2 o'clock in the morning so that we could beat the incoming tide and escape the fjord. Now, this sucked because not only did we not sleep that night before, it meant that we had to row flat out for the first 6 hours so we could escape the fjord before the tide turned. And this was not ideal for the start of a 2-week expedition, but thankfully we made it out of the fjord and we turned north towards the North Pole. While at sea, we were constantly moving. Our team of 6 was split into 2 3-man shifts, and each shift would row for 90 minutes, while the other 3, who were not rowing, would curl up in the small cabins that I pointed out to you earlier. Now, I'd like to say that this was quality rest, but it really wasn't. The best way to describe the rest is like being in the boot of your friend's car while they're driving. Now, sometimes when you're in calm waters, it's as though your friend is driving along a straight and flat road. You're able to curl up and it's fairly peaceful. However, the vast majority of the time, the seas are not calm at all. The winds are blowing, the waves are crashing in, and it's like your friend is driving really aggressively through a city, making sharp turns, accelerating, stopping. So you're in this car boot getting thrown left and right with no hope of any meaningful rest. So off we went, rowing in our 90-minute shifts, sometimes able to rest, but mostly not. And one of the questions I often get asked to do with ocean rowing is, how do you go to the toilet? Well, urinating was fairly straightforward. We'd pee into a bright orange jug, as you can see here, which was attached to the boat via a long string. We would then empty the jug into the sea, drag it behind the boat for a couple of seconds and rinse it out. Now, using the jug in calm, flat conditions, like on this, the first day of the expedition here, was fairly straightforward. But in high seas, finding enough hands to be able to hold the jug, pee, and hold onto the safety line so you don't fall over was a massive challenge. And bowel movements were a little bit more tricky to deal with. For this, we had a bucket. And there were a number of problems associated with using the bucket. Now, firstly, our bad weather gear, which we wore constantly, had a pair of trousers that had shoulder straps. They came right up underneath our top. So in order to be able to pull down your trousers, you first had to take off your waterproof top. You then had to take off your thick fleece mid layers. And this made it extremely cold immediately and would expose you to the wind and to the waves and the rain. So in addition to this cold, the small boat would be tossed about in the seas quite violently. So balance became an issue. So given all of this, you would only really use the bucket when you absolutely had to. Okay, so leaving pee buckets and poo buckets behind, the sea conditions were very calm, actually, as we started. We rowed north, and as we left Svalbard behind, it was a really surreal experience. Firstly, pebble-sized chunks of ice started to come past the boat. These pebble-sized chunks became football-sized, became boulder-sized, and before long, they were the size of cars, and then ultimately the size of buildings. And we were soon weaving our way through the icebergs using our compass to guide us north. And the sea remained calm as a pond, as you can see in this photo. And it really was a magical place to be, especially when we considered that we may well be the only people ever to have visited this exact part of the planet. Now, after going as far north as the ice would allow until we were completely blocked by the ice cap, we broke our shift pattern and stopped rowing for an hour just to soak in the environment. And it was really such a profoundly beautiful place to be, and something that I really can't do justice in a talk right now. Eventually, we tore ourselves away and we turned south and west towards Iceland, and the conditions changed dramatically. The conditions on board were already cold, but with an air temperature never exceeding 1 or even 2 degrees Celsius. But then the wind picked up, the sea became very confused. And by this, I mean that the waves were coming in from all directions, and they would regularly crash over the boat, soaking us through. Now, I'm lucky enough to be sponsored by Helly Hansen, the Norwegian outdoor clothing manufacturer who kitted out the crew, as you can see here. But after a while, even this gear couldn't keep us warm or dry. So we were constantly wet and we were always cold. We would begin a shift already cold, so you would have to row hard to warm up. But that would mean that you'd sweat, which made you wetter. So then when you stopped rowing to go off shift, you were wet and you were even colder than you were before. And the boat that we were using was designed for rowing crossings of the mid-Atlantic in tropical climates. So the cabins were really not suited to the cold at all. Our breath would condense on the ceiling, and it would then drip down onto our sleeping bags and sleeping mats. And within the day of the expedition starting, our sleeping bags were soaked through. You could literally wring out the water, and every layer of our clothing, from our socks, our leggings, our base layers to our hats and gloves, were constantly wringing wet. Now, we didn't take any photos during conditions of bad weather because it was just far too dangerous, but here's a brief video clip of a shift change on one of the calmer days to give a sense of conditions. So after 12 days at sea, disaster struck. We had a complete power failure. Now, we relied on solar panels and solar power to charge our water maker, to turn seawater into drinking water, and also to charge our electronic navigation system. And everything broke down completely. And we were forced to change our course and head instead to the tiny volcanic island of Jan Mayen. Now, using a paper map and a handheld compass, we rowed for 36 hours, hoping that we would see land. And all this time, we knew that if we were even 1 degree off course, we would miss the island completely, and in fact, not even see it. So this is Jan Mayen. It's a small volcanic island, a couple of 100 miles from Iceland. Now, thankfully, we did steer accurately, and the feeling of seeing land for the first time in 2 weeks at sea in a tiny boat was incredible. We could see the peak of the volcano just above the clouds on the horizon, and we were met on the beach by the Norwegian army, who have a base there, and they took us to their base for the most amazing warm shower and meal that I've ever had. And although we didn't reach our initial destination of Iceland, we did break a series of official Guinness World Records for Arctic exploration on this trip. And this included the highest latitude ever reached by an ocean rowing boat and the becoming the first team to cross the Greenland Sea. But this came at a cost. Because of the particularly cold, severe cold weather that we had on board, 3 of the team, including myself, suffered non-freezing cold injuries to our feet. And this is pretty much the same thing as trench foot. It involves damage to the nerves and the blood vessels in the feet. And it took me a good 18 months after the expedition to regain sensation in my toes. And even today, over 5 years later, my feet are still incredibly sensitive to the cold. So after a couple of years of enforced downtime, firstly because of the injuries to my feet and then because of COVID, last year I was again lucky enough to be invited to join an ocean rowing team, this time attempting to break another world record. And this time the expedition was to cross the Black Sea. Now this caught my imagination straight away because this was a part of the world I knew nothing about. I'd never visited any of the 6 countries bordering the Black Sea before, and I couldn't even name them. So I'm just going to give you 10 seconds now to think, how many of the 6 countries on the Black Sea can you name? Let's see how many you can get. Okay, so you might have got Romania and Georgia from the slide there. Maybe you also knew Russia and Ukraine from the news more recently. And now 4 out of the 6 is more than I knew when I began training for this row, which was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And big well done to any of you out there who knew that the remaining 2 were Turkey and Bulgaria. So here's the map. Now the route that we were to take was the longest possible distance across the sea, more or less, which started at a small port just near Constanta in Romania, and would finish in the seaside town of Batumi in Georgia. Now, the current record was 11 days and 6 hours, and this was set by our captain with a different crew, with a Romanian crew a couple of years earlier. So as with the polar row, the team was great. This photo was taken about 10 minutes before we departed from Romania. So on the left there, we were captained by Alex Dumbrava, who is a Romanian bear of a man, really strong rower, who was part of the team that set the initial record. Second from the left is me, and next is Roland Bear, a GB rower. He's previously rowed across the Atlantic Ocean, setting a world record along the way, and he'd completed a number of ultra-endurance challenges. And then finally on the right is Greg Bottoman, who is a hooker who played professional rugby with the Saracens and with London Welsh. And needless to say, he was a fairly strong guy. So this time for this row, in contrast to the polar row, I felt like I was a senior member of the team. Although I was the youngest, I was the strongest and the fittest on the rowing machine. And the Arctic row had given me experience of some of the worst conditions that you can experience on an ocean rowing boat. So the other crew members would look to me for training advice and also for psychological preparation. And I really relished this extra opportunity that came with this role. So I'd like to just revisit this map for a second. As a couple of months before our planned departure date, Russia invaded Ukraine. And you can see circled there the Crimean Peninsula on the north shore of the Black Sea and the cities of Kherson and Mariupol in the Donbass region, which was seeing really intense fighting and still are. Now, we were monitoring the news here very closely, with the clear implication being that the row might not be possible. However, despite this, although our departure port was only 100 miles south of the Ukrainian border, it was very much business as usual along the Romanian coast. People were still taking holidays at beachside resorts. The whole of this central southern portion of the sea was deemed safe. And unless the war spread any closer to Romania, the row would go ahead. So the row went ahead, and this photo was taken as we were departing the harbour with myself and Alex rowing the first shift. Now, this boat was a 4-person boat rather than a 6-person boat as we had in the Arctic, which meant that it was smaller and it was lighter. So this in turn meant that it could be thrown about by the seas a little bit more. Now, once we started, we had a great first 24 hours, and we actually managed to get ahead of the record pace. And I was feeling strong with no signs of seasickness as yet, but unfortunately, this would soon change. Now, day 2 saw bad weather roll in. Alex and I were rowing in the middle of the night, and we went through some of the heaviest rain that I had ever experienced. If I remember correctly, we were on the 2 a.m. till 4 a.m. shift, which was always a difficult one. And as we started the shift, it wasn't raining to begin with. After a few minutes, it started spitting, and then this ramped up to a steady, normal rain, the type that we normally get in Loughborough and in England as a whole. And this rain held for 30 minutes or so, and then it ramped up to a heavy rain for a few minutes, and then it went to what I'd probably describe as a real torrential, very heavy rain, the type that send people running to buildings for cover. But then it stepped up even further, and it reminded me of the wet season monsoonal rains of Central America. And despite shivering violently in the middle of the night as I was rowing and really questioning my life's decisions that had led me to this point, I remember being actually pretty impressed when the rain got even heavier still. It was absolutely deafening, and it felt like the sky was really pounding on us from above. My waterproofs were completely useless by this point, and I couldn't even open my eyes in order to see the little clock that we had to see how much longer we had on the shift. Now, eventually, Alex managed to read the small clock that we had on deck, and it turned out that we'd reached and exceeded the end of our shift. We were both totally exhausted, but we decided not to wake Roland and Greg for their shift. We wanted them to rest a little longer. We didn't want them to come out into this rain. So we kept rowing for another hour or so until the rain had eased a little. And then we shouted them to wake them for their shift. And I'm not sure that they ever fully appreciated what we did for them that night. But the rain eventually eased. And when that happened, unfortunately, the winds picked up. Even while rowing, we were being pushed back towards Romania. So we made the decision to deploy the sea anchor, which is a parachute that would hold us roughly in place until the wind changed. And I've got a brief video for you here, which shows Alex trying to tie the sea anchor lines to prepare it while the rest of us were curled up in the cabins. Thankfully, the storms had passed and it was game on again. So I'd soon learned on this trip that there were a lot of similarities between this row and the polar row. And firstly was the seasickness. I'd learned from my experiences on the polar row, and I had a range of seasickness remedies, including ear patches and tablets. And despite this, I was being regularly sick over the side of the boat for the first 3 days. For those of you who haven't ever been seasick, it's awful. Ranulph Fiennes, the polar explorer, described it the worst he'd ever felt. And this is coming from a guy who cut off several of his own fingers when he started suffering frostbite after he got back from an expedition. So imagine intense headaches and nausea combined with stomach cramps, fatigue, weakness, and then throw in this 2 hours on, 2 hours off shift pattern. And needless to say, I was very happy when the seasickness began to fade away on day 4. And the second similarity with the polar row was the sleep deprivation. Here we were using a 2 hours on, 2 hours off shift pattern, and the sleep deprivation was a massive factor, because by the time you'd eaten and washed, you could perhaps hope for 70 minutes of sleep when you had your off time. But that sleep would only be 2 hours a day, because during the day, when the sun was up, it was simply too hot to sleep. And this sleep deprivation was cumulative, and it really hit me hard on either the 5th or the 6th night, I forget which, when I actually walked my way onto a shift. I was so tired that I somehow managed to climb out of my cabin when I was shouted for my shift. And I sat down at the oars while my mind was still dreaming. And again, it was this dreaded 2 a.m. till 4 a.m. shift. And I remember clearly now sitting on my rowing seat, holding my oars and asking Alex where we were. I was really confused. Only about 10% of my brain was awake. And he told me that we were rowing. And apparently I told him that he was wrong. We weren't rowing. We were waiting for a bus by the side of a road in Scotland, which was where my mind was in dreamland. And he later told me that he asked Greg, our teammate Greg, to make sure that I was clipped on with my harness because he didn't trust me not to fall overboard. He still let me row though. Now, after rowing for about 45 minutes, I suddenly woke up with a start and realized where I was. So sleep deprivation can do really weird things to the mind and to the body. Now, despite these similarities between the Black Sea and the polar row, there were also a few key differences. And the most important thing for me was my own physical state. In the polar row, I had simply been surviving. I'd been getting through each shift, hoping that I would have enough strength to be able to make it to the finish. But here I was racing. Once I recovered from my seasickness, probably on day 3, I really attacked every shift. I was keeping a mental note of exactly how many kilometers we rowed with every shift. We had a little display that told us this. And I was calculating where this put us in relation to the record pace. I felt a real strength that I'd never felt before. And although I was sleep deprived, although I was losing weight fast, I was able to push hard with every shift for the whole 2 hours. And although the record was 11 days and 6 hours, I'd set myself this unspoken target of finishing in under 10 days. And with every stroke, I was motivated by this and I was pushing towards the target. Another important difference between this and the polar row was the temperature. After we passed the halfway point, the temperature rose by almost 10 degrees Celsius and climbed into the mid to high 30s. And inside the cabins, it was even hotter. And this was draining. And Roland, one of my teammates, began suffering from heat stroke and would vomit after every shift. And during the day, we changed our shift pattern to be 1 hour on, 1 hour off in order to have less sun exposure. And this did help a little. At one point, Captain Alex made the inspired decision to call a 30-minute break from rowing so that we could have a swim. Excuse me. My immediate reaction to this was to protest because I was racing and this would slow us down. But he was absolutely right. The second we entered the water, as you can see me doing here, we felt reinvigorated. The oppression of the heat just evaporated and we howled with joy. And we'd been working so hard that in that one moment, all of this tension just released. And I remember floating in the water with Greg and Alex as Roland on the boat threatened to row away and leave us stranded in the middle of the sea. And this memory is really one of my happiest memories from this trip. But that said, I really don't want this to make it sound as though the trip was all awful. I did honestly, genuinely enjoy it. We had some incredible sunrises and sunsets, as you can see here. We saw dolphins every day, which was really cool. And the night sky was truly breathtaking. When there were no clouds, the sky was a carpet of stars. And the best part was when we would row right through the arc of the Milky Way at around 3 in the morning. And this really gave us a sense of true remoteness. The sense of insignificance beneath the stars was, in some paradoxical way, incredibly empowering. Eventually, the skyline of Batumi, Georgia, came into sight, our finish line. We were met a couple of miles out by the Coast Guard, and we were given an escort in, and they took this photo of us as we approached the finish. Now, we pushed really hard. We were racing, remember, until we reached the harbor. And we reached the harbor 9 days and 18 hours after leaving Romania. So we had beaten my 10-day target. And reaching the harbor was a whirlwind of dealing with overly officious customs officials demanding passports and TV crews wanting interviews. And it wasn't really until I lay in bed in a hotel later that night that it all began to sink in. Now, changing pace slightly, in the title of my talk today, I promised to talk to you not only about adventures, but also about human evolution. So I'll now talk about my adventures and ocean rowing and how they link with my research. So my research as an evolutionary biologist focuses primarily on human adaptability and function. Now, to study how adaptation allows us to function in a given environment, I've developed two parallel research programs. In the first, sport is providing us with a framework to understand our evolutionary trajectory, our capacity for adaptation, and the underlying mechanisms. And in the second, nature is helping us to understand how adaptation to our ancestral environments is influencing our interactions with the world today. And taken together, both sport and nature are helping us to understand this interaction between environment, adaptation, and function. Now, given the topic of my talk today, I'm going to talk primarily actually about exclusively about the sports side of things. Now, over the last 10 years or so, I've worked with colleagues to develop and to define a new subdiscipline within evolutionary biology known as human athletic paleobiology. Now, human athletic paleobiology is the recruitment of athletes as study participants and the use of contemporary sports as a model for studying evolutionary theory. Now, over the last decade or so, this idea of using sport to study evolution has really gained traction. And I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about this, because this new approach is really improving our understanding of what the body does. And this in turn is shedding new light on our evolutionary trajectory, our capacity for adaptation, and the underlying biological mechanisms at play. So to relate this to our evolutionary past then, our species, Homo sapiens, we first appeared in sub-Saharan Africa about 300,000 years ago. Since then, we've colonized the majority of the world's habitable landmass. So as such, we can think of our evolutionary journey as having repeated cycles of dispersal and colonization of new environments. This evolutionary trajectory has brought us to many new environments, and this has brought with it food insecurity. Now, this food insecurity has meant that until very recently, our species has really existed at the margins of energy balance, barely consuming enough calories to meet our energy costs on a day-to-day basis. And as a result, our ancestors had to deal with energetic stress quite often. Now, this repeated exposure to energetic stress has created strong selective pressures for energetic efficiency. And by this, I mean that evolution has challenged us to develop mechanisms to appropriately distribute energy between our different physiological processes. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of Darwinian natural selection, which is based on the idea that individuals compete with each other for access to the resources that they need to survive and reproduce. Well, there is also competition for resources within your body, within the individual. And by this, I mean that all organisms, us included, we capture energy from the environment by eating, and we then use this energy to fuel a range of physiological processes related to, for example, immunity, reproduction, growth, storage, and of course, being physically active. But during conditions of energetic stress, during conditions of energetic stress, we don't have enough energy to optimize each of these biological processes. When we allocate energy to one process, we cannot reuse that energy elsewhere. So trade-offs arise between different traits. So that is to say that some traits are prioritized, but others must be sacrificed. Now, my research within evolutionary theory seeks to understand which systems are prioritized and which systems are sacrificed when we are energetically stressed. And ultra endurance athletes are helping us to answer this question, to understand how we allocate energy. Ultra endurance events impose a huge energetic stress on the body, and this provokes trade-offs, and we can detect these trade-offs. And for the first time, we are now able to directly test which processes are prioritized, which processes are sacrificed, in order to determine how we respond to energetic stress. Now, I've spent the last 5 years or so traveling to ultramarathons, such as these ones here, in the world's most extreme climates, to try to understand how we allocate energy. The first event there in the top left, that was a 200-kilometer ultramarathon in northern Finland in the Arctic, temperatures of -15 degrees Celsius. In the top right, this was a hot, humid race in the Amazon jungle. Competitors ran for 250 kilometers over 5 days in temperatures of about 30 degrees Celsius, but with humidity over 80%. In the bottom left, that was a race that I went to in the Everest Valley in Nepal, where athletes ran for 150 kilometers, but at altitudes of over 5,000 meters at times. And in the bottom right, that was an event in the south of Spain, 200 kilometers, but with temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. So all of these events were selected to place maximum energetic stress on the individuals. And hopefully this will start telling us what is happening to the body. Just skipping a little video there. I think it's too long. So what are we seeing? Well, what processes are being prioritized? Well, we first tested this idea of using ultra endurance athletes to study energy allocation at a 100-mile race in the UK. And this race was important because for us, it served as a proof of concept of our model of studying ultra endurance athletes to see which processes are prioritized and which processes are sacrificed. So at this event, we saw an energetic trade-off between reproduction and survival, in which reproductive function was sacrificed in order to maintain immune function, which was our measure of survival. Now, we've since built on this to do further experimental research, which has shown that sporting events can be used to study these trade-offs. Now, in this particular study, we found that cognition, that's brain function, was prioritized at the expense of physical power generation. And we think that this was an adaptive response because as a species, we may be more likely to survive stress and environmental challenge with a well-fueled brain as opposed to well-fueled muscles. And we also observed competition between different aspects of cognition. And this was really interesting, this study. I won't go into too much detail, but it was really interesting because we found that when people ran hundreds of kilometers through a desert, losing weight, very energetically stressed, their spatial working memory was prioritized. And this is a brain function that's linked to landscape navigation, but more importantly, calorie acquisition. So essentially, when you're energetically stressed, your brain will change its activation patterns to help you find food. So this was really cool. And the message that we're seeing here time and time again is that under conditions of energetic stress, energy is preferentially allocated to the functions that give you the greatest immediate survival advantage. We saw this when immune function was prioritized over reproductive function, when cognition was prioritized over physical function, and here when landscape navigation and calorie acquisition was prioritized. Oops. So to draw this together, I'd like to link my adventures with my research. And it was actually my adventures that got me into this area of research in the first place. I first developed my interest in this area as a master's student at Cambridge when I had the opportunity to join a team attempting to row across the Atlantic Ocean. I joined the team late on a free spot, and as a naive 21-year-old, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. We departed Gran Canaria, as we can see here, just after New Year and set off for Barbados, the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I was incredibly excited to be rowing off into the sunset, and images of dolphins and Caribbean beaches were filling my mind. But that very first night, my illusions were well and truly shattered. And after my first 2-hour shift, I was maybe 3 or 4 mouthfuls into a dehydrated meal pack when I felt an intense wave of nausea crash over me, and I was throwing up over the side of the boat, and my glasses actually fell off my face too. It was a bad start. Now, The winds picked up, and I would spend the next 3 days with waves crashing over the boat every couple of minutes, and I was really struggling. The seasickness meant that I couldn't eat for several days. The psychological stress meant that I couldn't sleep, and my condition deteriorated. I felt weak at the oars, and I could feel my brain slowing down even more, even slower than it is usually. But then on day 4, I began to adapt. After one shift, I ate half a Mars bar and I slept for 5 minutes. After the next shift, a whole Mars bar and an hour's sleep, then half a meal. I was recovering. And this was really strange to me because I'd always been told by my various coaches that to recover and adapt when working hard physically, you needed to rest. It was during rest that recovery would happen. But here, there was no scope for meaningful recovery. We were rowing 2 hours on, 2 hours off, not eating or sleeping enough. But as the days went by, I was pulling harder at the oars, and I could feel my mind really beginning to clear. And the prospect of spending a month doing this wasn't completely freaking me out anymore. And the reason I mention all of this is that I was fascinated by the way my body was able to adapt to the stress of the rowing, with the shifts, with the lack of sleep, with the undernourishment, and the high levels of physical activity. Now, despite the huge energy stress, my body was able to adapt and I was able to regain strength. So when I got back to the UK, I went straight to my professor and said, we've got to study this. This is cool. And so we did. We designed a research program studying ultra endurance athletes, which I've just mentioned. So to wrap this up, I'd like to link these a little bit more clearly, if I may. Now, I've recently written a series of papers describing how an understanding of both athletic performance and human evolution can be beneficial to both fields. And on a more personal level, I feel really lucky that my work and my adventures are so intimately linked. Both inform the other. It was my own experience as ocean rowing that gave this initial impetus for this research program. But in the other direction, I really do feel like my research helps me as an athlete. Now, during these various ocean rows and long distance swims I've done, I've been very aware of the changes happening within my body. Now, anyone listening now who's done a half marathon, a marathon, or something similar will know that endurance sport really exaggerates, it really amplifies everything. It makes the highs higher and it makes the lows considerably worse. But I found with ultra endurance sports, you also notice things change, like your ability to think clearly goes. Your digestive system can speed up or slow right down for no apparent reason. Your hormones are out of whack. And the lack of sleep can really do strange things to you, like the sleep rowing that I mentioned earlier. And this can all be very disconcerting for an ultra endurance athlete. And it could lead to you convincing yourself that you're pushing too hard, that you need to back off, you need to get some rest, you need to miss a shift. And all of this can really be detrimental.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. That's a fantastic talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it, which I'm sure everybody else did